Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me one quick favor, see that little black subscribe button on the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Really does help this channel grow, my audience grow, and I appreciate it more than you know. Also, quick thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet $50 on any game. Get up to $1,111 in free bets courtesy of the Betfred Sportsbook. Thank you again. Now, here's the video that you came here for. And if you listen to Friday's show, we talk every week, we wrap the show best and worst takes of the week. And one of the things I talked about was what Hugh Freeze and Auburn had up until last week done in recruiting. If you remember, I referenced that earlier in the week, I think it was last Thursday, there was a 5-star linebacker named DeMarcus Riddick who had been committed to Georgia, who decided last week to flip to Auburn. And I said, where Aaron was right, this is proof that I told you, Hugh Freeze knows what it takes to get it done at the highest level of the SEC. Said since the day the job opened, he was the guy they should go get. And so it was a good, solid recruiting win for Hugh Freeze and Auburn. And I get, by the way, one 5-star linebacker doesn't win you national championships, SEC championships, doesn't win you games, but it was a good sign of what was coming. But here's the crazy part, and this is what I want to talk about now. If you thought one little ho-hum 5-star linebacker, oh, that's good. That's great. Yeah, he was committed to Georgia. But how about this? Did you see what Hugh Freeze did this weekend in recruiting? Okay, so this weekend was a major recruiting weekend across the country. Most every program had big planned, scheduled recruiting visits from multiple players in the 2024, 2025, 2026 classes that they are recruiting. And so Auburn had theirs. It's called Big Cat Weekend, which, by the way, is the coolest nickname ever for a recruiting weekend. And I know it goes back a long time with Gene Chizik and all that, but it's still cool. But Auburn brought in most of their priority recruits this weekend. And one of them was a player named Perry Thompson. He is a 5-star wide receiver from the state of Alabama. Was, wink, wink, if you know where I'm going with this, committed to Alabama, the number 14 ranked player in the country, according to 24/7 Sports. Well, at Big Cat Weekend, on the campus of Auburn University, over the weekend, Perry Thompson, 5-star wide receiver, number 2 wide receiver in the country, had been committed to Alabama. He decides to flip to Auburn. So how about this for Auburn? Hugh Freeze. This is now the second 5-star player that they have gotten in the last week after, oh, by the way, they hadn't signed a 5-star since the 2019 recruiting cycle. And how about this? Their average player ranking. Now, they don't have a ton of commitments, but the average player ranking actually has them at number 4 in the country, behind only Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia. And so once again, and we talked about it, and we're going to get into some details here, but I told you months ago, when Hugh Freeze was a candidate for the Auburn job, this is the guy they needed. They get him, and it's already paying dividends. And what I'd say about Hugh Freeze and Auburn really quickly, I don't think Freeze has really gotten the credit on the national scale that he deserves, because up until this weekend, I don't know that he had that major splash that put everybody on notice, okay? But what he's slowly been doing, right? What do college football coaches talk about all the time? Stacking wins on top of each other. Stacking W's. It's not about one player. It's not about one workout. It's not about one good practice. It's about doing it repetitively over and over and over and over again. It's basically all Hugh Freeze has done since he got the job in whatever it was, late November, early December. First off, I think it's worth noting, his 2023 high school recruiting class ended up being ranked right around, I think, 18, 19 in the 24/7 Sports rankings. And if you just look at that in a vacuum, you'd say, oh, who cares? You know, if you have the 18th ranked recruiting class in the country, that's probably the 6th, 7th, 8th best recruiting class in the SEC. And the 18th ranked recruiting class in the country isn't going to beat Georgia and Alabama. But what I would say to that is, it's the old saying, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. And to understand why having the 18th ranked recruiting class in the country is impressive, you have to know where Hugh Freeze started, which is this. When Hugh Freeze took over at Auburn, the Auburn recruiting class was ranked in the 60s nationally. The 60s. Auburn should never be ranked in the 60s, but Brian Harsin, we all know, and we'll get to it in a minute in depth, basically didn't recruit when he was at Auburn. Then he gets fired, whatever. Hugh Freeze took over a class in the 60s and in like 5 weeks got it into the top 20, flipped a kid that had been committed to Ohio State, flipped a kid that had been committed to Florida State, that had been committed to Miami, that had been committed to Tennessee. And so he has a top 20 class when it's all said and done. That was the first sign that, okay, this guy gets it. Second step, by the way, the portal class is through the roof. And I know that if you look at a portal ranking, Colorado and Deion Sanders are ranked number 1 in most of those rankings. And by the way, deservedly so. Colorado brought in a lot of good players, but they also just brought in a lot of players. And I would argue that while it hasn't been as flashy as what Coach Prime has done at Colorado, what Hugh Freeze has done has been just as impressive. What Hugh Freeze has done in the portal is slowly rebuilt through, he's slowly rebuilt. He's done it more quietly. He's done it with fewer players, but he has really targeted areas of need. This was a program that needed depth at quarterback, that needed depth at O-line, at wide receiver. What does he do? He signs Peyton Thorne, former quarterback from Michigan State when they won 11 games a few years ago. He adds, I would argue, 4 starting quality offensive linemen in the portal, 4 of the best offensive linemen available. He adds a bunch of wide receivers. Jair Shorter, all-conference USA player at North Texas. Caleb Burton from Ohio State. So he's done it in the high school recruiting class. He's done it in the portal. But I really do think that the 2024 recruiting class was going to be the one that we ultimately judged Hugh Freeze on, right? Because you come in late in 2023, you can't make up ground. But in 2024, if you're good, that first full cycle when you're on campus, that's the sign of a coach that gets it. And really the best coaches. I mean, even go back to last year, criticize whatever. But Miami, Mario Cristobal, first full cycle, top 10 or so class. Go back to Steve Sarkisian's first full cycle, really good class. And that's where Hugh Freeze is trending right now. Now, I don't know if it's going to end up as a top 10 class because I don't know how many players he's ultimately going to end up taking. But as I said, 2 5-stars in this class, headlined by Perry Thompson, who committed this weekend, and the number 4 overall class in terms of player ranking. Remember, that is an important analytic to study and to follow. Every school signs a different number of players. So you might have the number 8 ranked recruiting class in the country, but you might have signed 29 players to get there. Well, right now, Auburn is like 16th or 17th in the country, but it's because they've only gotten commitments from a handful of players. And so we'll see how this class wraps up, but this is going to be, in terms of the average player ranking, probably one of the top 10 classes in the country. Now, in terms of a couple things, let me, what do they say? Let me just get it out of the way before anybody else, before I can even see the YouTube comment section. One, I already got when I mentioned DeMarcus Riddick. Oh, they're all going to decommit by signing. And listen, what I would say is this. Could a player or two decommit? Yes, it happens all the time. But if you look at recruiting in the spring and summer, I don't know what the number is, but my guess is well over 90 to 95% of players who commit in the spring and summer end up signing with the school that they committed to. And so I can't sit here and say that if they have 17, 18 kids committed today, that all 18 are going to sign on December, whatever. But the vast majority are. 2, by the way, don't tell me about NIL. You say anything nice about any program these days. Oh, well, it's NIL. It's just NIL. And I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. First off, I don't do rumors on NIL rumors and innuendo. Now, if you have a booster like John Ruiz coming out telling you exactly how much you're going to pay, that's a different conversation. But I didn't accuse A&M of anything a few years ago. I didn't accuse this school. I didn't accuse that school. And with Auburn, I'm not going to accuse them. 2, it's the SEC. Everybody's got NIL. And by the way, you know who had NIL last year? Was Auburn. And Brian Harsin wasn't getting players like this. And so what this says to me is exactly what I just said. Hugh Freeze is the right guy. And maybe as importantly, the last staff was not the right staff, or more specifically, Brian Harsin, the former head coach, was not the right head coach. Because it's crazy, right? Listen, one thing I don't like to do in general, when one coach has success and he's taken over, I don't like to go back, oh, that guy was the worst. Now, in some cases, it's obvious. You see USC in year one under Lincoln Riley, it makes you realize how bad Clay Helton was. You know, whatever. And it's kind of the same with Brian Harsin. I don't know the guy. I don't dislike the guy. But you talk to anybody who covers recruiting, covers college football, covers the southeast portion of the country, they'll tell you this guy just didn't even want to recruit. We talked about it at the time. They said recruiting wasn't a priority for him and his staff. And I've used the analogy before. I said, that's like me going to my wife and saying, sweetie, I love you. But communication, I'm just not that into it. We're just not going to communicate. I'm not going to try. It's the bedrock of a relationship. It's the bedrock of a marriage. And it's the same with recruiting in college football. You want to hear a crazy story? This kid, Perry Thompson, 5-star from the state of Alabama, did not have an offer from Auburn when Brian Harsin got fired. I'm sorry. That's malpractice. And it speaks to me what a mess that place was before and what the direction that it's going in under Hugh Freeze. Now, again, does not happen overnight. You are not going to become a college football power in one recruiting class. We've talked about it a million times. It's one of the reasons I don't talk a ton of recruiting, because recruiting isn't about one player. It isn't about one recruiting class. It's about doing it 2, 3, 4 years in a row at an elite level so that you can build a roster comparable to Georgia and Alabama and maybe Ohio State. That's why Michigan, as good as they've been, they don't recruit the same caliber of player. They've gotten to the playoff 2 years in a row. They haven't been able to close the deal. It's why Penn State's always on the outside looking in. It's why Lincoln Riley was always great on offense, but never had the total bodies on defense to get the job done. Why Brian Kelly left Notre Dame for LSU, because I just can't recruit the caliber of players I need to win at the highest level. And so 1 5-star and even 2 5-stars in a week doesn't guarantee anything for Auburn. But it proves to me, again, Hugh Freeze, right guy, gets it, gets what it's about, and most importantly, he gets what it takes to win in the SEC. If you're going to show up and you're going to think that it's going to recruit itself because you're wearing that AU on your chest, no, it's actually the exact opposite. You know who's the best recruiter in the SEC? Either Kirby Smart or Nick Saban. And you know what they also do? They also coach them up on during the week, coach them up on Saturdays. They scheme well. They're talent developers. You have to check all of the boxes. You can't just be a talent development guy. You have to do all of it. So credit Hugh Freeze. We'll see what happens on the field. I'm optimistic. I'm bullish on the Auburn Tigers. But I also believe, listen, we can only go based on today. And today, Hugh Freeze is cleaning up in recruiting.